Most people assumed Jabba the Hutt was just another crime boss who got fat and lazy in the desert, but he wasn't. He was so powerful that the Republic, the Jedi, and the Empire had no choice but to treat him like a legitimate head of state. And today, we're breaking down every major Hutt in Star Wars, from the most famous to the ones you've never heard of, starting with the king himself, Jabba the Hutt, Jabba Desilligich. Tiore didn't just run a criminal empire, he ran the criminal empire. From his palace on Tatooine, he controlled spice smuggling, gun running, slavery, bounty hunting, and piracy across the entire Outer Rim. His reach was so extensive that when the Republic needed access to Outer Rim hyperspace routes during the Clone Wars, they had to negotiate with him, not arrest him. Negotiate. The Jedi showed up, bowed, and made deals. The Empire did the same. And here's the thing. Jabba was 604 years old when he died. 6 centuries of debt networks, blackmail files, and corrupted officials stacked into a web so thick that pulling one thread could collapse entire planetary economies. His downfall started with Han Solo dumping a spice shipment to avoid an Imperial patrol. Jabba put a death mark on him. Boba Fett delivered Solo and carbonite, and Leia Organa strangled Jabba to death with the chain of his own slave collar at the Great Pit of Carkoon. 600 years of empire building, gone because a princess got her hands on a chain. But if you think Jabba was the only Hutt running Tatooine, you're wrong, because before him, there was another, and she owned the future Darth Vader, Gardulla the Hutt. Before Darth Vader terrorized the galaxy, he was a slave owned by a Hutt crime lord with a gambling problem, and I can prove it, Gardulla. Besaidi the Elder was a female Besaidi crime matriarch who held a seat on the Hutt Council and spent the final centuries of the Republic battling Jabba for total control of Tatooine. She ran the usual Hutt rackets, slavery, spice smuggling, extortion, but her real weakness was pod racing bets. She could not stop gambling, and one day, before the Phantom Menace, she bet big and lost both Shmi Skywalker and her son Anakin to Watto, a junk dealer from Mos Espa. That 9-year-old she gambled away would become the most dangerous man in galactic history. She literally owned the future Emperor's enforcer and lost him because she couldn't resist one more wager. But here's where it gets worse. Jabba didn't just outmaneuver her in business. He actively tried to have her assassinated. The power struggle escalated to the point where Gardulla was forced off Tatooine entirely, demoted from independent crime lord to Jabba's representative on Nal Hutta. She went from running her own empire to being his employee. That's how badly she lost. And yet somehow, legend sources claim she outlived almost everyone. She survived the Clone Wars. She survived Jabba's reign. She was still breathing long after her influence had completely collapsed, reduced to a cautionary tale about what happens when a Hutt's vices destroy them from the inside. At least Gardulla's downfall was her own fault, unlike the next Hutt, whose destruction came from his own nephew. Zero the Hutt, Zero was Jabba's uncle, and he was too clever for his own good. This flamboyant crime lord controlled 7 star systems and ran nightclubs out of Coruscant's underworld. Most Hutts stay in Hutt space. Zero embedded himself in the galactic capital and made the Republic deal with him face to face. But controlling systems wasn't enough. He wanted the entire Hutt clan. So he conspired with Count Dooku to kidnap Jabba's infant son Rata. The plan was elegant. When the Jedi sent to rescue Rata died, the Republic would look incompetent. The Hutt-Republic alliance would collapse, and Zero would step in as family head. Except the Jedi didn't die, and the whole thing unraveled. Here's where it gets complicated. Zero kept a secret holodiary. Every dirty deal, every cogitic crime, every piece of incriminating evidence on Hutt operations across the galaxy, he used it as leverage against the Grand Hutt Council. The Council feared that holodiary so much that Cad Bane held the entire Galactic Senate hostage just to break Zero out of prison. The Senate held hostage to free one very flamboyant Hutt. After his jailbreak, Zero fled to Nal Hutta, but paranoia doesn't buy loyalty. His former lover, Sai Snoodles, tracked him down and shot him twice in the chest. Jabba had hired her to retrieve the holodiary, which she delivered straight back to his palace. Zero's grand plan ended with him murdered by someone he trusted, and the one thing meant to protect him went directly to the nephew he tried to overthrow. That's what happens when you create the most dangerous object in the underworld and keep it in your own hands. At least Zero had ambitions. The next Hutt on this list was just trying to survive being a bargaining chip. Rata the Hutt. In 22 BBY, the entire Republic military strategy for the Eastern Theater of the Clone Wars hinged on keeping a sick baby Hutt alive long enough to return him to his crime lord father. That baby was Rada, nicknamed Pedunky Muffkin by Jabba and Stinky by Ahsoka Tano, and he was Jabba's infant son and heir to the Hutt Empire. Here's the thing, he was secretly kidnapped by Asajj Ventress and taken to the monastery world of Teth as part of a plot orchestrated by Count Dooku and Zero the Hutt to frame the Jedi, derail Hutt Republic negotiations, and clear the way for Zero to take over the Hutt clan. The Republic went to absurd lengths to get him back. Anakin Skywalker and Ahsoka Tano recovered him from Teth, kept him alive despite him falling gravely ill mid-transit, and returning him safely to Jabba secured the Hutt's cooperation with the Republic war effort. Which is to say, galactic hyperspace access depended on whether a Padawan could keep a crying slug baby from dying of space illness. But wait, it gets better. Even after being safely delivered back to Jabba, Rada remained a pawn in the game. The entire kidnapping scheme nearly succeeded in permanently poisoning the Hutt Republic alliance, and Zero came within a hair of pulling off a Hutt clan coup using an infant as the catalyst. For years, Rada was the MacGuffin everyone forgot about, a footnote in Clone Wars history who never reappeared in any major capacity after being handed back to his father. The crying slug baby who almost derailed the entire war effort simply went home and vanished from the story entirely, which is honestly the most realistic outcome. Not every hostage grows up to be interesting. At least Rada survived, unlike the next Hutt on this list, who spent decades scheming and still died face down in a swamp. Marlow, the Hutt Marlow, is the Godfather joke made literal. His visual design in the Clone Wars is deliberately modeled on Marlon Brando's Don Corleone, complete with the old man jowls and the wheezy voice, making the organized crime parallel as explicit as the show ever gets. Which is fitting, because Marlow's entire character is about business. Cold, pragmatic, profit-first business. Born around 997 BBY, Marlow sat on the Grand Hutt Council alongside Jabba, Gorga, Arak, and Aruba, governing vast smuggling routes, slave systems, and client species from Nal Hutta. When the Republic and the Jedi came to negotiate hyperspace access during the Clone Wars, they weren't asking nicely. They were negotiating with a sovereign power whose approval was required for galactic military logistics. That's the level Marlow operated at. Here's where it gets interesting. When Darth Maul showed up with his Shadow Collective and started carving through the underworld, the Grand Hutt Council didn't resist on principle. They ran a cost-benefit analysis. Marlow's primary calculation wasn't survival or honor, it was profit. Whether joining Maul's alliance would keep the Hutts at the center of galactic crime. And when the numbers worked out, he agreed. The council allied with a warlord who had already committed mass murder, because the math said it was good business. That's the most honest summary of what the Hutts actually are. Not noble houses, not even traditional warlords, just supremely organized criminals who will shake hands with anyone if the price is right. The irony is that Marlow rarely gets a personal downfall on screen. His likely fate is tied to Darth Vader's massacre of the Hutt Council, meaning one of the most powerful Hutts of the Clone Wars era probably died entirely off-screen. No dramatic monologue, no final stand, just erased, like a line item in someone else's ledger. But at least Marlow kept his family drama mostly internal, unlike Gorga, who had to deal with Jabba's entire legacy collapsing on top of him. Gorga the Hutt. Everyone knows Jabba died in spectacular fashion, strangled by Leia and left to rot in his own palace. But almost nobody knows what happened next. In Legends, Jabba's nephew Gorga inherited the entire operation and expanded it even further than Jabba ever had, which means the most famous criminal empire in the galaxy was just the opening act. Gorga Disilijic Arpo was already powerful before Jabba's death. He shared leadership of the Disilijic Khajidic during the Clone Wars and held a seat on the Hutt ruling council, representing the clan's interests in inter-Khajidic politics. That positioned him at the center of decisions about hyperspace routes, slavery networks, and cartel alliances across Hutt space. He wasn't some minor cousin waiting in the wings. He was already running half the empire. But here's where it gets interesting. After Jabba's collapse, Gorga didn't just maintain what his uncle built, he grew it. Where Jabba concentrated power on Tatooine and the Outer Rim, Gorga expanded operations into broader galactic territory during and after the Civil War. He turned Desiligic from a regional cartel into a diversified, era-spanning syndicate. syndicate. In pure strategic terms, that makes him more successful than Jabba. He just did it quietly. And Gorga used the same playbook Jabba perfected. When the assassin Rai Kuda started targeting his interests, Gorga hired Boba Fett to handle it. Fett killed Rai Kuda, problem solved. Elite bounty hunters doing the dirty work while the Hutt stays safe in his palace. It's the exact pattern Jabba relied on for decades, and Gorga kept it running like clockwork. The most striking thing about Gorga is that he wins by not being flashy. Jabba wanted everyone to know he was untouchable, which is why he kept Han Solo frozen in carbonite as a trophy and threw elaborate executions at the Sarlacc pit. Gorga skipped the theatrics and focused on profit. That's why his empire outlasted Jabba's and kept growing while other Hutts were getting wiped out by Vader or betrayed by their own families. But Gorga's story is legends only, which means his entire post-Jabba empire exists in a continuity most new fans will never see. At least Gorga made it work behind the scenes, unlike Boku, who tried the exact opposite approach. Baku the Hutt, Boku, might be the most modern Hutt on this list in terms of storytelling style. Less Godfather, more Game of Thrones. And here's the thing, he was genuinely audacious, operating from a lair in the Outer Rim instead of rotting away on Nal Hutta like the other council members, surrounded by Gamorreans, Bith, Nikto, and Klatooinians. Baku positioned himself as a field operator while his peers collected dust. During the War of the Bounty Hunters comic event, he makes the boldest play any Hutt counselor attempted in the Imperial era. He strikes a covert alliance with Crimson Dawn's leader Chira, feeding her intelligence and cooperation as part of her larger scheme to destabilize every major power structure in the galaxy at once: Hutt, Imperial, and Criminal. Baku thought he was using Chira to undercut his rivals and climb the council ladder. Turns out no. Chira was using him to blow up the entire institution from the inside. His back-channel scheming with Crimson Dawn put him at the center of one of the most dangerous power plays in the post-Yavin underworld. And it worked, sort of. The problem was that Boku was running his schemes inside a situation that Chira and Darth Vader had already rigged. He thought he was playing chess. He was actually a pawn in someone else's game, and the board was about to explode. Which brings us to Vader. Baku's plotting brought him to the direct attention of the Dark Lord, whose confrontation with Baku and the Hutt Council resulted in exactly what you'd expect when you irritate Vader: lethal retribution. The council was decimated. Most of them died. The entire Hutt cartel collapsed into chaos just before the events of Return of the Jedi, creating a power vacuum that nobody was prepared to fill. Boku's story represents the exact moment when Hutt overconfidence collides with both Crimson Dawn's subterfuge and Vader's absolute ruthlessness. By scheming to leverage Chira against his rivals, he helped trigger the destruction of the very institution he was trying to climb. He didn't lose because he was incompetent. He lost because he was running a regional mob strategy inside a galactic superpower conflict, and nobody told him the rules had changed. At least Boku had ambition and a plan, unlike the next Hutt, who somehow made it onto the Grand Council, despite being almost entirely useless. Myarga, the Hutt. Here's something most Star Wars fans get wrong immediately. When they hear Myra the Hutt, they assume it's a typo, a fan invention, or some obscure Legends character nobody cares about. Turns out it's none of those things. The correct name is Myarga the Hutt, and she's one of the most strategically dangerous figures the High Republic era ever produced. Myarga operated somewhere in the window of 500 to 100 years before the Skywalker saga, which puts her squarely in the middle of the Republic's Great Expansion period. While the Senate was busy congratulating itself on spreading civilization across the Outer Rim, Myarga was quietly positioning herself at the center of every trade lane that expansion depended on. Not beside them, not adjacent to them, at the center. That's the Hutt playbook, and she wrote a significant chunk of it. What makes her genuinely interesting, beyond the standard Hutt crime matriarch setup, is the alliance. At some point during the chaos unleashed by the Nihil Marauders, Myarga entered a working arrangement with the Jedi. Think about that for a second. The Jedi, the Republic's moral backbone, partnering with a Hutt crime lord because the alternative was worse. She didn't join them out of principle. She joined them because the Nihil were bad for business, and Myarga had a very clear sense of what was and wasn't good for business. That temporary alliance says more about her than almost anything else. She understood leverage. She understood timing. She knew exactly when cooperation benefited her more than opposition, and she acted on it without hesitation or sentiment. That's not a villain's instinct. That's a strategist's instinct. Her story also remains unfinished in the current High Republic publications, which is either frustrating or exciting depending on how patient you are. The groundwork is there, the character is there, what her full arc looks like is still being written, which means everything we know about her right now is essentially the setup. And given what the setup looks like, the payoff has a lot to live up to. Jiliak the Hutt. Everything you think you know about Jabba the Hutt is about to get complicated, because before Jabba was the undisputed crime lord of Tatooine, before he was strangling people with chains and dropping them into Sarlacc pits, he had to answer to someone else, and that someone was Jiliak Desaligic Tiure. In Legends continuity, Jiliak was the leader of the Desaligic Khajiit in the years before the Battle of Yavin, which means during the period most fans assume was already Jabba's era, he wasn't actually in charge. She was. As clan head, Jiliak controlled the major Desaligic holdings across Hutt space, smuggling corridors worth billions, slave-based economies that spanned entire sectors. She personally oversaw the deployment of Desaligic enforcers against rival Khajiitics like Basadi, meaning she was the one calling the shots when clan wars broke out. Legends, narratives depict her as an older patron figure to Jabba, a mentor essentially. She outranked him in the clan hierarchy and brought him into large-scale criminal ventures that shaped his development as an underworld operator. Jabba wasn't born running an empire, he was trained by someone who already had one. Every deal he learned to close, every rival he learned to crush, every network he learned to exploit. Jiliak taught him that, or at least gave him the platform to figure it out. But over time, things fell apart. Inter-clan rivalries escalated. Assassination attempts became more frequent. Political alliances shifted, and suddenly Jiliak's ability to project strength started to erode. In some accounts, she became pregnant, which is rare among Hutts and politically destabilizing in a culture where showing vulnerability is a death sentence. The exact sequence of events varies depending on the source, but the outcome is consistent. Jiliak died before the Battle of Yavin, and with her removal, the last major internal check on Jabba's ambitions was gone. That's the part nobody talks about. Jabba didn't build the Desaligic Empire, he inherited it. What fans think of as his natural dominance, his inevitable rise to the top of the Hutt underworld, that was actually the outcome of a messy, violent succession inside a criminal dynasty he did not create from scratch. Jiliak ran Desaligic. Jabba just outlasted her. So the next time you watch Return of the Jedi and see Jabba on that throne, surrounded by wealth and power and slaves, remember this: none of that was his to begin with. He took it from someone else. Jabba the Hutt, the most iconic crime lord in Star Wars, inherited his throne. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.